and thanks for completing that initial poll. So now, without further ado, I am delighted to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Eowyn Crisfield. Eowyn is a senior lecturer in English language and TESOL at Oxford Brookes University, and a Canadian educated specialist in languages across the curriculum, including EAL, home languages, bilingual and immersion education, super diverse schools, and translanguaging. Her focus is on equal access to learning and language development for all students, and on enhancing approaches to linguistic diversity in schools. She's author of the recent book Bilingual Families, a practical language planning guide, and co-author of Linguistic and Cultural Innovation in Schools, The Languages Challenge. Welcome, Eowyn, and over to you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. It always sounds like you're talking about somebody else. So the first thing I'd like to say before we get started is thank you all for coming. And in particular, thank you to the school leaders. I presented at the ECIS MLI conference just last week. And one of the things that we note and that I mention a lot is that we struggle to get school leaders to come to conferences about languages because there are so many other kind of big ticket items that school leaders are required to attend. So it's really good to see so many of you here as school leaders interested in languages in your school. The second thing that I'm going to tell you is that I'm not going to give you answers today. This is not a session in which I will help you fix all of your languages challenge. Instead, what I'm hoping to help you do is to ask better questions and to connect those questions to your own environment and develop answers that fit your school. And so it's not a tips and tricks webinar. It's really about the thinking that goes into designing the fit for purpose languages program within international schools. So the first thing I'd like to highlight is the kinds of discourse that we have around bilingualism and multilingualism in international schools. Very often we frame the discourse around the added value of languages. And in particular, we talk about this idea of the market concept of languages. How is a student going to be more valuable as a student, as an employee, as a person, because they are bilingual or multilingual? And in this approach, we think about which languages add most value for a student from almost a purely economic perspective. There's also a lot of discourse around the focus on potential cognitive benefits of bilingualism. When I read international school websites, particularly those that are bilingual, there's often a heavy emphasis on how becoming bilingual is beneficial cognitively. And while that can be true in some cases, I think that what we're missing is a focus on all of the other kinds of value that students get from becoming or being bilingual or multilingual. And some of these we're going to talk about today: the value for integration, the value for communication, identity, and personal prospects. And personal prospects are different from the attributed market value to any particular language. And so I'd like us to step away a bit from kind of that languages as an economic value and think about languages as personal value for our students. And that will shift our entire way of thinking about what we teach and how we teach it. So the reality in international education is that languages are at the center of everything we do. The complexity in our schools of our students and our staff and our curriculum mean that we have to focus on the language of instruction, which is English, and we have things that are often called EAL or ELL to support language learners. We also have a huge diversity in home languages in our student population. We also have a requirement or kind of a duty of care to teach the host country language. And then we also, in most secondary schools, certainly, and even in some primary schools, also teach world languages. So when we look at how much space languages take within our schools, we can recognize that, in fact, they are a uniting characteristic. Every student in an international school is a language learner on some level. And in IB schools in particular, all are either already bilingual or multilingual or becoming bilingual or multilingual by design. Our approaches to language in our schools are also central to our approaches to international mindedness and global citizenship, or they should be. It's very difficult to deliver a strong approach to international mindedness without talking about linguistic diversity and valuing the languages our students speak. And so we really need to recognize that even though the language challenge in each school is different, the languages challenge in international school is really central to who we are and what we do. So the first thing I'm going to ask you, and there's going to be a poll that will pop up here in a sec, is do you have a home language program in your school currently? That should probably be enough time to answer that quick question, and let's have a look at the results. Okay, 71% have said yes and 29% no. I am very pleasantly surprised about that. Thank you for participating in that poll. So going back to this idea of the learner and the context, let's talk first of all about the language of instruction, which in most schools, not all, is English. If you teach in a school where the language of instruction is not English or not only English, whatever I say in this part is also relevant to any language of instruction. So what we know about designing an EAL program is that we need to design programs that provide equity in terms of access to learning. And what that looks like is, for our new to English learners, they need a short intensive program that will help them develop their basic English and their literacy skills. And this needs to be delivered outside the main classroom, because sitting in a classroom where you don't understand anything is not an efficient way to learn English as a beginner. And this program should be really carefully tailored to develop basic English skills, but also English specific to the curriculum of your school. And this means we can't use an out-of-the-box textbook or EAL program, and certainly not an English language teaching program. It means we need to take the time to design a program that fits the needs of both our curriculum and our students. All of our learners, all of our language learners, but actually all of our learners in international schools also need a language integrated curriculum in which the language objectives sit alongside learning objectives, and language is explicitly taught and scaffolded. And we know that this is the most effective way for immersion to work. We can be immersed in English and learn English to a certain level, but to really raise ourselves to an academic level, we need specific teaching of academic English across all of our subjects. And so understanding how to build a language integrated curriculum and how to differentiate for students who are beginners in English, intermediate in English, and advanced in English will allow us to make sure all of our students are accessing the curriculum as best they can. And finally, the third pillar is a strong tracking system and teachers who understand what it is and how to use it. Notice I didn't say a strong testing system. Testing and tracking are very different things for EAL. We need to track our students' English language development because that will be connected to our curriculum. So again, using outside sources to assess, or standardized assessments to assess their English, won't actually assess effectively the language they're learning. And so what we need to do is track them in their classes. How are they doing with their English language development as connected to our curriculum? So those are the three pillars of a successful EAL program, or ELL, or any other language of instruction. So moving past language of instruction, let's talk about home languages. This one is often considered, and there's a strong argument to consider it the most difficult level of curriculum development in an international school. And so I'm going to just cover a little bit of research first, so you know why I'm spending so much time on this, but also because you can take it back to your schools and really dig into the why alongside digging into the how. So this is the research base on the role of a student's home language in their education. Here's a first quote from Jim Cummins, and this is one of the most common quotes we see from Jim Cummins, and I think it really highlights the identity and the whole child aspect, that for affective reasons, we need to make sure we're welcoming the whole child, including their language, into our school. On a more pragmatic or practical side, we also know that the best way for children to learn is through a language they already know. And so we have a kind of a socio-emotional side, and we also have a practical and educational side. And I'd also like to highlight under this, the Article 30 of the United Nations Children's Rights Convention is about the child's right to develop in their own language. And so we don't talk about that very often, but it is there. And many schools, most international schools, are UN Rights Convention supporting schools. And so you can see very clearly that we have to think about this aspect of our practice as well. So the research shows us very clearly that students are better off linguistically when they access at least part of their education through their home language. Students are better off academically when they access their education through their home language, and students have increased engagement and well-being when they access education, at least partly in their home language. So this is kind of 3 facts that come from a very, very large body of research that's global in nature. It's not about international education in particular, it's global in nature. So it's on, minority language children in the Netherlands, minority language children in Canada, in the US, Australia, France, everywhere where the research has been done, it shows these things quite clearly, that there is a strong advantage to children, linguistically, academically, and in terms of engagement, from accessing at least a part of their education through their own language, in particular in the early primary years when they're new to school. This is something we don't often talk about in international education, how strong the research is about this one fact. And I'm going to show you another quote by Jim Cummins. This is my personal favorite, but it doesn't come up as commonly as the other one. But I think it really gets to the heart of the matter, that we spend a lot of time in schools in general and in international schools in particular, trying to help speakers of other languages learn English effectively without considering the cost for that. All the while, we're trying to help everybody in our school learn another language. And so I see this kind of globally. Everybody's trying to learn English at school, but they're also teaching them French, and they're losing their home language in that. And so I really think that what's at the heart of this is that an English language international education is considered a privilege by the school, by parents, by the children themselves. And when we look at something through a lens of privilege, how lucky you are to be going to this wonderful school, how lucky you are to be experiencing this wonderful curriculum, how lucky you are to have all of these opportunities to develop native speaker English, we don't necessarily think about the price that these children potentially are paying in terms of their own language and identity. And the fact that every linguistic opportunity comes with a potential cost. And for many internationally educated students, the cost is full proficiency in their own language, which limits their personal prospects in terms of living and working and going to school in their own country as an adult. So what we need to recognize is that we have a duty of care to support our students in becoming bilingual or multilingual, not only supporting them to learn English. So I'm going to give you just some examples of how we can support home languages in schools, first through a framework of planned approaches, and then through linguistically innovative approaches in schools. So I've identified 3 different structural approaches, and there are obviously, of course, variations on this. The extracurricular approach to home languages in schools is basically saying you can have a home language program. We'll give you a classroom. We'll put it on our after-school activity schedule. Off you go. And so it's easy to schedule. It doesn't cost the school anything, and it provides a kind of a lip service support to the importance of home languages. There are a lot of cons to this approach, though. First and foremost is that the teachers are not hired by the school or trained by the school. And so if it's the parent groups responsible for finding the teachers, you get a wide variety and implementation of what a home language program is. And so you see things happening like the Italians are making pizza and talking in Italian, and the French kids are doing dictation and and learning conjugations. And that's it's a stereotype, but it's something I see really often is different cultural groups approach the teaching of the home language very differently when they're given carte blanche to do whatever they want. There's also to the children, though, a message that their home language is optional and often in place of something they'd rather do. So you get kids who can't go to football on Tuesdays because they have to go to Polish, or they can't go to art on Wednesdays because they have to go to Chinese. And that doesn't really set up positive attitudes for the children if they feel that it's being forced on them in place of other activities they'd rather do. The second approach is what I call a parallel approach, and this is where it's scheduled into the school day. So there's a home languages block. So there's no extra obligation for students to do it outside. It supports the status of the home languages, and it's usually taught by trained teachers because the school is taking some responsibility for having them be a part of the school day. Cons are obviously the cost of providing teachers and resources. And if you take a parallel approach, that means that the school is not dictating or managing what happens in each of those classes. So you get that still kind of the quality of the curriculum offered will be varying according to languages. And because it's parallel and not integrated, it's not accredited. It doesn't appear on their report card. It doesn't appear as a part of their regular learning. Which leads me to our third approach, which is the fully integrated approach. And an integrated approach is where it's scheduled into the school day. The school takes responsibility for the teachers. The school takes responsibility for the curriculum, and it is a regular and reported part of the student's progress. And so this is obviously the most robust approach in order to really have it just become an integrated part of the student's learning rather than something that they do on the side. Obviously, this comes with cost, and there's a huge kind of time cost as well in terms of making it work. And honestly, I know very few schools that are doing a fully integrated approach. I know some that balance between parallel and integrated for the languages that are most common amongst their student bodies. And so very often schools will work across a combination of models in order to support as many home languages as they can. Then we come to approaches that are perhaps less structured, but also more innovative. There are so many ways schools can support home language development without having a formal program that hires extra teachers or that includes scheduling. And so when you're thinking about the delivery of home language support, you can be as creative as you want. For some schools, the big question you may need to ask is actually a bilingual program a better option than English only? So if your whole student body is children from the host country, so the new model of international school, so you're in Thailand, all the children are Thai, and the language of the school is English, for those students, a bilingual program would be a better fit. You have automatic full development of both the school language and English. The tricky question there is, of course, how to sell it to parents. Then you have multilingual pedagogies, translanguaging, biliteracy work, all kinds of innovative ways in which languages come into the classroom alongside English for learning for learning and assessment purposes. There are schools that I work with that use students as tutors very effectively. So they have high school students come down and work as home language tutors with schools with younger students, and that's really effective and cost-free. And there's also the aspect of building really strong collaborative working relationships with parents so they understand how they support the home language at home effectively, which will then support their children in learning at school. And so you don't have to always plan for a big kind of hydra of programs. You can look at what you can do within your curriculum and within your school time that's innovative and effective. So language of instruction and home languages we've covered. I'm just going to ask you one question about host country languages, and that is, do we approach the teaching of host country language in ways that develop international mindedness? And by this, I mean, one of the things we see quite commonly in international schools is a lack of value placed on the host country language. We teach it because we have to. We don't really worry about how it's being taught, or we let children opt out of it, or we opt children out of it to put them in EAL. There are all kinds of things that happen that undermine the status of the host country language that actually are counterproductive to our work around international mindedness and global citizenship. And so we need to make sure that we're paying as much attention to host country language as we are to other languages. And finally, world languages. You may think that this one's quite straightforward and everybody should be getting this right, but again, we can stop and think about whether our choices for the world languages we're teaching demonstrate our value for diversity and our value for the local. So international schools shouldn't all be teaching French and Spanish and German. There is a lot of space to look at the languages spoken around the school and say, well, it would make more sense to be teaching. For example, if you are an international school in South Africa, it would make more sense to be teaching Kiswahili than French. And so you can look at that and start to make your choices based on what is right and natural in your environment rather than on what is high status and international. So I'd like to just draw you to think about how all of these aspects of languages we've talked about are linked to our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And I'm going to start with diversity and how do we recognize and activate the linguistic diversity in our schools in ways that go past food flags and festivals. In terms of equity, how are we ensuring all of our students have access to learning even while they're learning English. So that's our EAL provision and our language integrated teaching. How are we making sure that learning English isn't causing learning loss? And then finally, inclusion. And this is a broad one, and we could talk about this for hours, if not days. Part of it is the diversity and inclusion. Do our students see themselves in the learning we do? Are we choosing our texts appropriately? Are we making sure that we're teaching history from multiple perspectives and not only from an international Western perspective? And also it can be a much more concrete inclusion. When we talk about EAL children, we often say, oh, the best place for them is the classroom. But if they're in the classroom and they're not supported, that's not an inclusive approach, it's an exclusive approach. And so there are all these links that we can think about as we're moving towards approaches that are more holistic in our schools. So I'm going to finish by opening some space for discussion and then asking you to do a little reflection as we move into the questions. So we're going to put the student at the center, and we're going to ask ourselves these questions. How does our school live the languages of our students? How might we be acting in ways that are detrimental to our student language profiles and identities? When I talked about this last week, somebody put in the chat box, first do no harm. Okay, we're obviously not doctors, but there is in a sense we can be doing linguistic harm to our students if we're not making sure that their own language continues to develop as well. How do our language support provisions, EAL or other, ensure that all of our students are learning what they need to be learning? And finally, what is our next step as a school in moving towards full linguistic and cultural inclusion? And on the next slide, I'm going to show you a continuum that I've developed that will help you think about that last question, and then you'll answer it through a poll. So this is what I call a continuum approach to multilingualism. It can be in international schools, it can be in any school. We start with positive attitudes. And when we are a school that has positive attitudes, we hear things or we see things like all languages are important, and students might be encouraged to bring a flag for International Mother Language Day. They might be encouraged to bring food at different times of the year. So there is a positive sense around multilingualism and languages. The next step along the continuum is passive positive practices. Passive positive practices is allowing students to use their languages socially, so not saying we only speak English here. And sometimes in class we might say, oh, what is this in your language? Or, oh, what is this in your language? Okay, so that's passive positive practices. The next step on the continuum is active positive practices. This is where you see schools and teachers actively planning languages into school events, so showcasing diversity. And teachers actively planning for the use of other languages in the classroom through, for example, translanguaging. So you're using translanguaging to make sure that you have an educationally inclusive approach. You're using translanguaging to ensure that you're showcasing the diversity of your students. You might think that this sounds pretty good. And if we're here, why is there still a blank space on the rest of the screen? This isn't the place at which you're finished. The place at which you're finished is where we enter what we call the multilingual habitus, which is the opposite of the monolingual habitus. And a school that is this far on the journey is a school in which they don't have to actually pay that much attention to planning anymore, because it's just a natural part of their practice. And so multilingual languaging is normal across the school for the students and for the staff. And the linguistic landscape and social and visible reflects the diverse nature of the students and the staff and is always dynamic and changing. And so once we've reached the multilingual habitus, and I do know a couple of schools who are here, there's much less time spent on planning because all of these really solid practices just happen naturally as a part of their regular curriculum and pedagogy. So I'm going to have another poll pop up now, and I'm going to ask you to answer two questions. The first is, where are you as a teacher on this continuum? And then where are you as a school on this continuum? And that will help you answer the question, what can we do next? Where you see perhaps gaps opening up between yourself personally and the school that you work for and with. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to think about this one, because I know that this is kind of a big question to be asked to answer this early in the morning or this late at night, depending on where you're joining from. Okay. There we go. Oh, look at that. 23% say that as a teacher, they're in the multilingual habitus. Fairly close to what the school says. That's really, really positive. Thank you very much for sharing that with me. I think that that leaves lots of space to discuss, and I'm really happy that that so many of you see yourselves at least in the middle of the continuum, either personally or as a school. So I'm going to close down and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can all see each other's faces again for the Q&A.
Thank you, Eowyn. That was great. Right, as Eowyn said, we've now got some time for some questions. Heather has popped one into the Q&A box, so I'll get started with that. And then whilst Eowyn's answering that one, do please pop any additional questions that you've got so that we can answer any questions you've got. So Eowyn, the first question from Heather is, as a language teacher myself, I would love to see a more integrated approach, but how do we convince our admin teams that this is an important addition that needs to be addressed? And Heather gives the example that her country is very much invested in bilingualism as the mother tongue language day as a result of their fight for keeping Bangla in their past. But she has a student who's bilingual French and Portuguese, but wasn't able to help the student continue with those two languages in school. And she wants to better help students who are multilingual. So what advice can you give her for convincing her senior leadership team and admin team that that's the right approach?
Oh, if I had that answer, I'd be able to retire. It's a really tricky one because I meet, of course, in the course of my work, many teachers who are further along that continuum than their schools, and they're always looking for that solution. And I would say that there's a huge value in what Susan Stewart from MLI calls small conversations. So just kind of drip feeding. Every once in a while, a little bit of research, a little bit of, just a small conversation about the value of other languages. I do find, and this is strictly anecdotally, that bilingual schools seem to struggle more to support other languages outside the two of the school. So they've got that mindset that these two languages are really important. And they put so much time and effort into the full development of those two languages that they kind of lose sight of other languages in their identity as a bilingual school. And so that, anecdotally, I've seen this in several different countries, that bilingual schools have a kind of a bigger, I would say, almost pushback against other languages because they're so invested in the two that are part of the curriculum. And so I would say, ask for time and space to talk about it, and make a really good, quick, short presentation that has the highlights from research that says, that for all of our students, this is really important, and then propose a really straightforward solution. So with these students, this is something that I could do every Monday and Wednesday for, 15 minutes. But also I would say clear information for the parents is really key, because in schools, there's only so much we can do if the school structure isn't there to help us move past kind of passive positive practices. And then our best allies are the parents, and having the parents know what to do at home in order to support the continued growth of the home language at home and connect it to what's happening at school. So that parent partnership where the parents know when the Unit ecosystem comes home, we need to sit down with our child and do some research on ecosystems in Portuguese to develop their Portuguese and to develop their content learning. And so there's no one solution. It's usually kind of a puzzle we put together.
Thank you. Roland asked a question earlier on, which I had a go at answering, which I might not have answered correctly. And he asked, I think you probably addressed this, but just in case. So what is a home languages program?
So a home languages program is essentially like you would teach French as a world language, you teach the home languages of the students. And so some schools have an additional block for language teaching. So, every Monday, every day from 9 to 10 is world languages. Every day from 10 to 11 is home languages. And the children are parceled up by their home languages and they go and work on those languages. That's obviously a fully integrated approach. But it's really when kids who share a same home language come together for the purpose of continuing to use and develop that language for educational purposes.
Great, thank you. Kevin asks, with English as the exclusive assessment instructive language in Asian countries, how do we strive their access to the expected curricula? So for example, International GCSE, IAL, or the IB Diploma Program, when they come to school in grades 8, 9, or even 10 at A2?
So, contrary to the popular myth that young children learn languages more quickly, there's actually an advantage for students to start in about grade 7 or 8, because by the time those children come to you, I'm presuming their Mandarin, their Chinese is solidly developed. And so you don't have to worry as much about that. You just have to you have to think carefully about how do you use Chinese to develop their content learning and to develop their English. And so your translanguaging would happen. For example, if it's year 8 and you're doing an inspector calls, because that seems to be what everybody does in year 8, you have them reading a Chinese version of inspector calls alongside the English version, and then their English can develop more quickly because they understand the content that they're learning. And so you look at how you use then the strength of the home language to help build English more quickly. But it is difficult for kids in a non-English speaking environment to come into school in secondary school and reach the level of English they need to be able to perform to their full potential on externally set exams. That it's a high bar that's being set for those children. Absolutely no doubt. For sure.
Great. Roland's come back with another question. Thank you, Roland. So we are a very multilingual school, and students among themselves tend to speak a mix of German, English and Chinese, which can only exist in the trilingual environment of our school. He's asking whether that's something to be happy about.
Yes and no. To a certain extent, when we share the languages of students who are language mixing, we can appreciate the high level of linguistic skill they're displaying by bringing those languages together. But at the same time, and I think I know what school you're coming from, there is obviously exams that need to be sat in English and in German and potentially in Chinese that require them to only use one of those languages. And so what we work with then is developing a multilingual ethos around classroom language policies that help students understand that, in this environment around this task, we really have to do our best to only use German because the output needs to be German because we're going to be examined on it in German. And so it's not about banning languages or being kind of punitive about it. It's about being collaborative, that when you're working on your own, you can mix them all you want. But for certain learning activities, we have to really try to be as monolingually focused as we can because of the pressure that's coming at the end for the exam.
Great, thank you. Diane's asking, the IB Diploma Program offers some home language as part of Group 1 as self-study for students. What's your opinion of this?
I think it's better than nothing. But I know a significant portion of students choose not to do the IBDP self-study because they don't want to do it on their own. And so I think it's much more effective if they have a multilingual group that has a teacher that's helping them do IBDP Lang and Lit, and that they work on the content in their own languages, but they function as a class together. And so they still get that sense of a class that's supported by a teacher. I think that that's more effective than just having them work with a tutor online or, by themselves that their parents found.
Great, thank you. Justine is asking, thank you for everything so far. Glad you're enjoying it, Justine. Her question is, when you work in a school with many different home languages, and she's quoting 40+ different home languages, which approach to the HL program, to the home learning program, do you feel seems to work best?
So partly it depends on how many you have. You could have 40 languages, but 50% of the kids speak one. But the easiest way to move forward in a super diverse school is through multilingual pedagogies. So having your teachers really understand how to draw on and support language use in the curriculum, which supports your students who are learning English to access the content, but also supports the continued development of home languages. And so that can be the kind of the easiest way to do it. And I think in particular, if you're an IB school, using your CAS to have students from the secondary school come down and work with primary school students is another really good way, because it's good for the older students to get that experience of using their own language for education again. And it's really good for the little kids to see older kids who speak their language. And again, it doesn't cost anything. You give them some training and it becomes a part of the school's CAS program.
Wonderful, thank you. Lorna's just popped a message into the chat, which I'll read to you. It says, thank you for your presentation. I'm sitting here with my Danish and Swedish students who are learning their home languages. Brilliant.
Excellent.
Thanks for joining us, Lorna, and hello to all your students. Rena's asked a question. You've mentioned the research several times. Can you direct us to the research?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I'm expected to produce a blog about this topic probably very quickly. What I'll do is I'll put citations in the blog, but if you're looking for something quick and easy to go to, Oxford University Press published a paper in 2019 called The Role of First Language in Education, and that's a really good kind of primer with all of the basic research in there.
Wonderful. I will just ask my colleague Christian, who is on the line. Christian, would you be able to pop a link to the blog into the chat and also a link to the sign up form for people for the blog, please? The blog that Erwin is referencing is the Pearson International Schools blog, and she's right, she does owe me a blog post. So we will publish Erwin's blog post on there. So if you want to go to that link and bookmark it, or if you want to sign up to the blog, you can do so, and then we send you a fortnightly digest of the blog post that we've published in that time. All sorts of topics to do with international schools, educators, senior leader content as well. You'll find lots in there. So Michelle is asking, given the current international situation, we have Russian-speaking students who are or may be feeling uncomfortable speaking their home language at this time. How are schools talking to students, particularly primary schools, and supporting them at this time? Or what advice could you give potentially?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I would say that part of the answer has to do with most people's unfamiliarity with Eastern European languages. So they may not be able to tell if it's Russian or Polish or Ukrainian. But I think just being open that, you know, the children in your school who are Russian speaking are not responsible for the current situation, and that their language is still their language and has as much value as any other language. We need to talk to kids about these things because they're a part of their world, and avoiding them or ignoring them will just make the situation worse.
Absolutely. And Kevin, I think Kevin's referring back to the research that you were just talking about. He's asking, was that article from the ELT journal in 2019? No,
it's a white paper that the Oxford University Press published. So if you actually just type in OUP, the role of first language in English medium instruction, I'm pretty sure it will be one of the top ones that come up. But I'll put the citation to that one in the blog for sure.
Okay, brilliant. Right, that's the end of our questions now. So all it remains for me to do as we come up to 1:45 is to thank you, Erwin, and to everybody who has joined us here today. Certificates of attendance and a link to the recording of this webinar will be sent to you by email tomorrow. And as an attendee, you'll also now receive a Big Think delegate badge, a digital badge via the Credly platform that you can add to your LinkedIn profile to say you've attended the Big Think and you are now skilled in the topic that Erwin has talked to you about today. So the email with instructions for you to claim your badge will be labelled Pearson from Credly. So please do look out for that later today or tomorrow, and do check your spam folder if it doesn't arrive. And then within that email will be instructions for how you can claim your badge and then share it across your social channels. I will, before we leave, just give a quick plug for the next Big Think in our series, which takes place on the 23rd of March. In this one, we're going to be sharing more about our Pearson EdXL roadmap for on-screen assessment and sharing more about our work in this space. So it's definitely one to bookmark and attend if you can. Registration for that webinar is now open on the Big Think page where you registered for this one. So do check it out. And I do hope you can join us again. So that's it for today. Thank you again, Erwin. Thank you to all of you for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and rest of the week. Bye.
Bye.